For as long as he could remember, Martin Fletcher had hated dogs because they were untidy, noisy, and only caused problems. However, everything changed one chilly morning when he saw a tiny, injured puppy resting in the edge of the ditch. For someone who had spent his life on his farm, the sight was startling and unexpected. Everyone who knew him was completely startled by what he did next. Life shying dogs away. The puppy was hardly moving its. A quiet cry pierced the stillness as the small form shook in the damp grass, tugging against. Martin stood there unsure of what he had inside of him, torn between doing anything and leaving. Martin's neighbors frequently made fun of him for being completely out of character and said that his heart was as hard as the rocky dirt of his fields. But something changed at that precise time, and the events that followed would determine not only Martin's life, but also this. Defenseless creature. What could have motivated a man so aloof to offer a helping hand? And why did this one act of generosity ignite a journey nobody could have predicted? Join us as we reveal the remarkable tale of Martin Fletcher and his unanticipated connection to a wounded puppy Martin had spent. He spent 62 years in the same little rural town, encircled by expansive fields. He lived in an old farmhouse that had withstood decades of storms and decrepit fences. Regular and solitary man who gets up before dawn to tend to his crops and goes to bed with the town's residents when the sun sets. Nobody dared to allow their dogs roam close to his land, since he was known to be stern and distant, and he had a reputation for chasing. He swore and clapped his hands to get them off, but that morning was different since the frost had melted just enough to form a. Martin struggled along the gravel path, hands tucked into his tattered coat, when he noticed a tiny sheen of dew on the ground. He initially believed the little, immobile lump near the road's edge to be a piece of trash or a discarded coat, but his feet slowed as he approached, and he recognized the small animal as a puppy. It was tightly coiled, its white and black fur tangled with filth, and its left paw was. Martin paused as his fingers twisted at a strange angle, and its small chest rose and fell faintly but steadily. His instinct told him to leave it to the dogs as he hovered in midair, seemingly undecided on whether to pick it up or shuck it away. Had always bothered him by barking at night, destroying gardens, or chasing animals. It's something about. Unaware that he had a stupid mute, he grumbled under his breath as the puppy shuddered, but his. Martin sighed in frustration when his boots finally remained grounded and he shrugged off his coat, tenderly encircled the dog and held it against his chest. Despite the creature's feeble yelp, he carried the puppy back to his farmhouse, feeling heavier with each step. Apart from the occasional stray cow and the prospect of adopting a puppy, Martin had not previously engaged with animals. It felt ridiculous to be an animal he had vowed to abstain from for decades. But as soon as he stepped through his front door, he began to whisper. After Martin brought the puppy inside and placed it on an old blanket by the hearth, he poured a bowl of warm water and took an old biscuit tin out of the pantry, breaking one into small pieces for the puppy. Barely sniffed at the offering without moving its eyes, although it did open briefly to look at Martin. As the day went on, the room became strangely quiet, as though the entire universe was holding its breath. Martin pondered his options because he wasn't a veterinarian or a dog enthusiast, and the closest veterinary clinic was too far away. Managing his ancient truck, so he did the only thing that came to mind. He phoned. Martin thought that his next-door friend Clara, who had a reputation for having a soft spot for animals, may provide some guidance without getting too close to his abrupt change of heart. And when Clara came, she entered and let out a gasp. Martin, having a dog is a miracle in and of itself. Don't start complaining, Martin. Clara crouched next to the dog and gestured for me to follow her instructions. Examining its pores and softly petting its head, I can see that it is starved and dehydrated, but I believe it will pull. Martin scowled and Clara grinned. Yes, Martin, I'm feeding it and cleaning it if you're willing to put in the effort. It's ensuring that it doesn't worsen because the words won't mend itself. Suspended in midair as Martin gazed at the small creature, feeling its tiny body rise and fall with ragged breaths, he muttered, I'll do, with a peculiar sense of duty, as if the puppy's survival relied solely on him. For the next 3 days, Martin's life took an unexpected turn, and he fed himself as Clara instructed. When the puppy was able to stand on its unsteady legs for the first time, the soft food cleaned its wound and kept it warm. Martin couldn't help but feel a twinge of pride despite barely supporting it. He hadn't realized how involved he'd been, up until that point, but caring for the dog wasn't without its difficulties. When his buddies at the general store learned, they began to taunt him nonstop, and Martin's stern demeanor did little too. Discourage their jokes. It appears that Fletcher has softened. One man laughed. Perhaps we should start referring to you as Dog Dad. Martin dismissed the remarks, but he felt a mix of humiliation and unyielding determination. He hadn't intended to get connected yet, but each time the puppy cuddled up close to the flames or waggled its small tail at him, he sensed a slight softening of his heart. As the days stretched into weeks, the puppy, who was now called Scout after Martin's father's nickname, started to flourish as the black and white filled out its once frail and weak frame. Under Martin's care, Scout's fur softened and became lustrous, and she followed him everywhere, limping a little from his damaged paw. But he wasn't going to let it stop him from restoring the crops. Martin discovered that the puppy was constantly near him, yipping at his heels and wagging its tail while he was moving fences or carrying firewood. He was grinning more than he wanted to own because he had never thought of himself as the type of person who would converse with a dog. But while Scout looked up at him, he was moaning about the weather or complaining about his injured knee. Like he understood every word. And it was a very quiet form of camaraderie. One afternoon, while Martin stacked bundles of stuff, Scout was devoted and totally unexpected, but not everyone was as smitten with her. Clyde, his lifelong neighbor and occasional drinking partner, showed up in his own beaten car and loaded grain into his pickup. With his large figure casting a shadow across the truck bed, Clyde hopped out and looked downcast at Scout. "Well, I'll be. I didn't think I'd live to see the day Martin Fletcher kept a mutt on his property," Clyde replied, crossing his arms. Martin spat. "He's not a mute," and Clyde laughed. "His name is Scout," shaking his head. "What's gotten into you, Martin? Never thought you'd fall for one of them flea-bitten strays. You know dogs like to clench their jaws," but Clyde wasn't done yet. "He doesn't belong on a farm. They cause more trouble than they're worth. Trust me when I say that this will turn against you. One day, you'll be sorry you kept him around." Scout, sensing the tension, barked a little and approached Martin's. Martin put a protecting hand on the dog's head and reached down. "He's not going anywhere," he said firmly. Clyde smirked and shrugged, leaving no space for debate, before getting back into his truck. "Suit yourself, but don't. Claim I didn't warn you." Martin felt a glimmer of doubt grow as Clyde drove away. He had spent years removing animals from his property because he believed they would only cause problems. But now, look for this small, active puppy that managed to get inside Martin's. Clyde was correct in life, and Martin erred by keeping him later then. Martin couldn't get Clyde's remarks about the puppy out of his head as he sat by the fire that evening with Scout curled up at his feet, getting stronger every day. Yet the thought of discovering him hurt and defenseless persisted. What if Clyde was correct, but Scout moved, putting his head on Martin's shoulder, suggesting that keeping him would be more bother than it was worth. The simple gesture of booting and letting out a satisfied sigh let Martin realize something deep within of him. Martin was not a stray dog. Scout was now family, and Clyde had no idea what he was talking about. Martin poured himself into field work over the next 3 days, with Scout by his side constantly, as he was about to give up on him. They removed brush, fixed fences, and even went into town to get supplies. The town's residents, who were still dubious about Martin's new friend, observed with interest as, one afternoon, the elderly farmer held a bag of dog biscuits in one hand and a sack of feed in the other, as Martin and Scout. While working in the fields, a violent storm blew across the sky, turning everything black and causing the wind to. Rain started to pour in huge sheets as the trees howled, converting the dirt into thick mud, which Martin rushed to collect. Returned to the farmhouse with his equipment, but Scout had other ideas. The puppy had noticed something in the. Despite Martin's cries, Scout fled his little frame when he noticed a slight movement close to the property's edge. Martin felt a wave of panic as he rushed after the dog, his boots slipping in the mud, disappearing into the storm. When Scout returned here, Martin yelled, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar, and he eventually arrived at the edge of. Scout was curled beneath a tree in the field, his body shaking and drenched, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Yet, there seemed to be another dog, this one larger and with matted fur, ferociously defending. In a limp with terrified eyes, Martin hesitated, his thoughts rushing yet again. Turn around and let it handle itself, like he would have done before Scout arrived, was his instinct, into his life. But he later witnessed Scout pushing the hurt dog as his tail was wagging, seemingly indicating that they couldn't leave it. Martin sighed as he took off his coat and put over the bigger dog. He mumbled, "You're going to be the death of me," as he picked up the stray he did for Scout weeks previously. The storm continued to rage as Martin carried the larger one, stumbling back toward the farmhouse Scout and trotting proudly at his side. Rainwater tugged on the wooden floor as Martin placed the injured dog in his farmhouse Scout, following closely after. He swiftly fueled the fire in front of the fireplace, placing the two dogs on an old quilt, and the warmth of the fire filled the room. Martin snatched up a fresh towel and knelt down next to the stranger as he started to tremble. The larger dog had mud-caked spots on its fur and a mix of white and tan, with piercing golden eyes. Color tinged with fatigue and exhaustion as Martin carefully removed the sludge. Observed something odd. A jagged scar on its front porch was evidence of an old. The sight of the partially healed injury evoked a memory that Martin was unable to pinpoint. Scout. Wagging his tail in an attempt to reassure the bigger dog Martin couldn't, he sniffed curiously at the visitor. He mumbled, scratching behind him, "You're a real social butterfly, aren't you?" I couldn't help but smile at Scout's excitement. When Martin looked at its back, Scout's ears, the larger dog that sensed no danger, relaxed a little but continued to cry. Martin ran his hands and said, "Leg easy there." His voice was softer than he had anticipated. Moment he felt the obvious swelling of a sprain or fracture, frowning along the limb. The storm outside showed no indication of slowing down, and Martin realized he would have to wait until the following day to take the dog to the veterinarian. He remarked, getting up and going to the kitchen, where he filled a bowl with water and gave it to me for the night, back placing it next to the bigger dog, who paused before gulping it down avariciously as the storm subsided. Martin was seated in his battered armchair, and Scout, the bigger dog, was cuddled up at his feet, sleeping restlessly by the fire. They occasionally released gentle whines, as if they were haunted. Martin leaned back, wondering where the dog had come from and whatever had caused it to get to this point. Did someone ditch it as though they could read his mind? Or was it just another stray? Martin was grounded by Scout's simple act of stirring and resting his head on his knee, which reminded him of how far they'd. Since he discovered Scout, he looked back to the bigger dog, who appeared to be sleeping more soundly now. Martin carried both dogs onto the farm home as the sun rose above the storm clouds the following morning, illuminating it with a golden glow. Scout eagerly jumped in his truck, curled up next to the injured person, and carefully lifted them into the back seat. The drive to the veterinarian was uneventful, save for the larger dog, as if to keep it company. The sporadic yips of encouragement from Scouts, Martin laughed to himself. "You're rather." The veterinarian, Dr. Harper, greeted the caregiver. "Are you not at the clinic?" Martin Fletcher, with not one but two dogs, looked surprised and amused. "I never imagined seeing the..." Martin complained, but a small smile pulled at his lips. Don't start." Harper used a trained hand to examine the larger dog, furrowing her brow as she looked at the scar on its paw and the injury to its leg, saying, "This isn't your typical stray," as she looked up at Martin. "This dog has experienced a lot, probably mistreated or utilized in unlawful altercations. Those scars are not the result of an accident." Martin felt a surge of rage build in his chest, saying in a low voice, "People like that shouldn't be allowed to have animals." Harper nodded in agreement, but regrettably, it occurs more frequently than you may imagine. Fortunately, the limb injury isn't too bad, and with time and attention, the dog should fully recover, according to Dr. Harper. After bandaging the leg and giving it a little anesthetic, Martin couldn't help but think of Scout and how the puppy had altered his viewpoint, seeing that after everything this dog had been through for Scouts, he couldn't abandon it just yet. Martin's heart had already been touched by unwavering devotion and love in unexpected ways. Perhaps there was. When they got back to the farmhouse, Martin made a comfortable area for the bigger dog by the fireplace. Instantly, Scout huddled up next to it, pressing his tiny head against the larger dog's flank. Martin observed as the scene develops, an odd sensation spreads through his chest. "You have a talent for." Martin, said the Scout, shaking his head. "I guess we're in this together now." Later that evening, as we picked strays. As he sat on the porch and watched the sun set below the horizon, Martin became aware that the larger dog's scar reminded him of. He reminded him of a story about a dog-fighting ring that was uncovered in an old newspaper article. Could this dog be a survivor of the operation in the nearby village of Maid? Martin's musings were interrupted by. Martin grabbed the stick and flung it when Scout nudged his leg while his tail was wagging, and he was laughing hysterically. Despite its size, the larger dog was curiously observing from the porch as a Scout ran after it across the yard. Yet, there remained a glimmer of hope and a spark of life in those brilliant eyes. Martin experienced a sense of purpose for the first time in years. He was learning from these dogs in addition to providing care for them. Something deep about fortitude, faith, and the ability to mend the farmhouse acquired a new rhythm as Martin adapted to caring for two dogs, Scout being a lively and, curiously, it appeared like Dell had shared a companion with Martin's larger dog, adopted the name Bailey, who was more reticent and frequently sat quietly by the fire or observed the world through the eyes of the living. Bailey's injuries necessitated ongoing care, so Martin did what Dr. Harper instructed, carefully putting ointments on Bailey's scar and making sure his legs' bandages were replaced. Initially, Bailey's golden eyes were wet and startled at every touch. Untrustworthy Martin's voice was firm and soothing throughout these moments, saying, "Easy, boy, I won't hurt you." During these sessions, Scout would frequently sit next to Bailey as though attempting to convince the larger dog that their link remained, becoming stronger, and Martin saw that Bailey appeared to calm down when Scout was close. Bailey's wary manner softened over the course of several weeks, and he followed Scout into the yard while limping a little. However, Martin would observe from the porch with his coffee in hand, displaying an increasing interest in his surroundings as Scout scurried around the yard, urging Bailey to play timid games of chase. Despite Bailey's sluggish and purposeful, his movements had a discernible lightness about them, as if the burden of his past were beginning to fade. Martin made the decision to take both dogs into town one cool fall morning. The journey to Maid was essential since Martin had errands to run and Bailey needed follow-up care at the veterinarian. It had become second nature to load dogs into his truck, with Scout jumping in with excitement and Bailey requiring a little assistance, persuading before slipping into the passenger seat. And the drive went well, except for Bailey's sporadic glances. Martin talked to him while he drove his car, and he seemed both interested and uneasy about the world beyond the window. "Don't worry, Bailey. We're only going into town, and there is nothing to be concerned about." Fearful, Dr. Harper welcomed them with open arms when they arrived at the veterinarian's office and was clearly impressed with Bailey's development. After checking the dog's leg, she said, "You did a good job, Martin. The swelling has gone down, and his mobility is getting better. He's recovering well." Martin nodded, his chest swelled with pride. Martin chose to stop briefly at the general store after they left the clinic, proving that he is tougher than he appears. Wasn't a location he typically visited, but he thought the dogs could manage a quick visit and needed supplies for the property. Wait in the truck, Scout leaned his nose to the window and waggled his tail wildly in anticipation of new sights. And since as Bailey relaxed on the sofa, his amber gaze sweeping the busy street, Martin collected what he needed to exchange inside the store. He acknowledged me with courteous nods from the few residents of Ridge, a little hamlet where everyone knew one another. Word quickly spread about Martin's new friends as he walked up to the cashier's counter. Martin shrugged his gruff shoulders as a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes grinned at him and said, "I hear you've taken in a couple of strays." Manner displaying a trace of self-consciousness, simply carrying out the necessary tasks that not everyone would. As Martin carried the items into the car, she responded, giving him his change, saying, "Those dogs are lucky to have found you." Truck, he saw a small group of people congregating outside a neighboring cafe. Curious, he walked past Scout and Bailey in tow, but was halted in his tracks by what he saw, a poster attached to the The bulletin board in Cafe B had a fuzzy picture of a dog that looked much like Bailey. Martin's heart fell when he saw the headline, "Help us find him survivors of Meadow Ridge dog fighting ring still missing." He studied the article's specifics, which explained how other dogs had gotten out of the ring before rescue efforts could be launched. Many of them had been located, but some, like the one in the picture, were still missing, Bailey Martin muttered. He crouched down to the dog and put a hand there, his speech a mixture of grief and resolve. As if sensing the gravity of the situation, Bailey cocked his head and met Martin's golden eyes. Martin sat in silence for a while after getting back to the truck, his thoughts racing because he knew Bailey's past was dark, but the poster's stark layout made it impossible to overlook the fact that this wasn't just a puppy in need of. Bailey was a survivor with both apparent and invisible wounds. Martin decided that he would do more than just assist Bailey's physical recovery as they traveled back to the farm, doing everything he could that night to make sure Bailey felt secure, loved, and free from the shadows of his past. As the farmhouse fell into its typical silence, dogs were lying by the fire. Martin picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Harper. "Doc, I think I need to know more about Bailey's past." He spoke in a firm voice. "Doctor." Harper's response was considerate, "And I'll see what I can do to help if there's a way to find out where he came from. Can locate Martin, but be ready. It may not be simple." Martin looked at Bailey, who was sleeping soundly next to Scout, but there was nothing worthwhile to do. The next morning, Martin woke up earlier, more than normal. The image from the poster tormented him, and the revelation about Bailey the day before weighed hard on his thoughts. Bailey was no ordinary stray. He had gone through something. Martin's. After caring for the patient, the resolve to learn more about Bailey's death got greater by the hour. Morning tasks. Martin sat at his kitchen table with his old laptop, which he hadn't used in a long time, and a cup of coffee. Years, but it was time to dig. Bailey was sleeping at his feet while Scout was asleep. The farmhouse was silent next to him, except for Martin's steady tapping of his fingers on the computer as he looked for. It was difficult to find information about the Meadow Ridge dog fighting ring. Press reports described the police raid and the rescue of other canines, but the information was grim, and Martin's stomach turned to the conditions he read about. In a cruel underground enterprise, dogs who are chained and undernourished must struggle to survive. Highlighted Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary, a nearby shelter that had taken in the rescued canines, and Martin noted the phone number hesitated briefly before calling. The line rang several times before a kind, welcoming voice could be heard. Martin cleared his throat and said, "This is Sarah from Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary. How may I help you?" "Hello, I'm Martin, and I believe I have one of the runaway dogs." There was a silence on the other end of the line after Sarah's call from that fighting ring you guys dealt with some time ago. Tone changed to one of caution, "And I'm curious if you have any information to give." Martin explained Bailey's appearance and the advertisement he had seen in the city. He described how he had discovered Bailey afraid and hurt. "He seems like he might be one of them, and Sarah has been taking care of him ever since. If you're comfortable, we might have records, so we could check for any identifying marks or microchips if you could bring him in. That might aid in reconstructing his past." But Martin was hesitant about bringing Bailey somewhere new. He knew that was the proper thing to do, so even though it didn't sit well with him, "I'll bring it by tomorrow." That night, Martin wrapped the bandages over Bailey's body to get him ready for the visit. "We're going to figure this out, boy. You've been through a lot, but you're safe now. I'll make sure," he said to him. Scout remained nearby, resting his head as though he could sense the seriousness of the situation. The two dogs' friendship had gotten deeper every day on Martin's lap, and Scout's appeared to assume the position of, always at his side, Bailey's guardian. Martin loaded both dogs the following morning, got into the truck, and headed to the Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary, which was tucked away in a peaceful area of the country, side with paddocks for rescued animals scattered around and encircled by rolling hills. Bailey sat up straight as Martin parked, his amber gaze sweeping the strange. Sarah welcomed them at the scene, and Scout seemed unconcerned by the change of setting, waving his tail. "You must be Martin," she murmured, stooping, her grin warm and inviting, down to welcome the dogs. "And this must be Bailey," who retreated a little. Sarah's gentle manner appeared to calm his tense muscles. "He's a beautiful boy," she remarked softly, extending. Martin nodded, his hand resting on Bailey's back as she held her palm for him to sniff. Sarah led them to a calm examination room after they had gone through a lot inside. While Sarah went over the shelter's paperwork, the veterinarian joined them and examined Bailey closely. Bailey, for a microchip Martin, held his breath, but the veterinarian eventually said there was no chip, stated with a shake of his head, although he does have some noticeable scars that fit the description Sarah has on file. Consulted her notes, and if he is one of the dogs, we will do everything in our power to assist him. However, Martin, it is up to you whether you. Martin scowled, his protective instincts taking over. You mean to keep him? Sarah asked cautiously. Some of these dogs are eventually placed in new homes, while others remain with their rescuers if they are in a secure, caring setting. Wish to impede his development. If he's flourishing with you, Martin's face softened. He's not leaving, Sarah. Before they departed, Sarah gave Martin a smile, which is what I thought you would say. Informational material about the rescued dogs. It included resources for canine care and updates on the others. Someone have experienced trauma, so don't be afraid to ask for help if you ever need it. She said that Martin's mind was racing with questions about what he had learned as he drove home. More about Bailey's history, but it seemed like only the beginning when they trotted into the yard at the far with Scout. Martin observed them for a moment, his heart heavy with a mixture of emotions, their tails wagging. Later that evening, when the dogs were cuddled up by the fire, Martin looked through the packet with a mixture of thankfulness and sorrow. One of the stories Sarah had told him about a dog named Luna that had been adopted by. The report described her recuperation and the difficulties she encountered after being saved from the same ring. However, it also highlighted her tenacity and the affection she brought to her new house. Martin glanced at Bailey's scars, hardly perceptible in the cozy firelight. "What get there?" he whispered quietly, one step at a time. Over the next few days Martin's daily routine was unusually quiet on the farm, and Scout kept running over the fields with his. Bailey's trademark vigor appeared to change, despite the initially cautious. Pup had become more at ease with Martin and Scout, but occasionally he would sit by the window and look restless. His amber eyes were focused on some far-off point ears that were twitching in response to slight sounds. Martin, who was the only one who could hear, became aware of these changes and couldn't get rid of the impression that Bailey was struggling. Unresolved, Bailey's background was brought to light by the sanctuary visit. Yet, additionally, it had raised fresh queries about what memories remained in Bailey's head. One morning, Martin decided it was time to recall the people who had harmed him or the pets who had suffered alongside him. Bailey remarked, to push past his hesitation, while crouching next to the dog. "You've gone through a lot, and I'm not sure what's going through your mind, but we'll work this out." With his tail waving slightly, Bailey leaned into Martin's touch with Scout. Sensing the moment's somber tone, he sat down next to them and pressed his nose against them. "That settles it," Martin mumbled, noting that the gesture of support against Bailey's side wasn't lost on him. Martin took this a step further that afternoon, calling Sarah at the sanctuary to inquire as to if there. Sarah's voice was kind but wary as she responded, "Are there any updates regarding the dogs that were rescued alongside Bailey?" "Actually, Martin, some of the other dogs have been assigned to something. One of the foster families saves a younger girl, while others are being trained to adapt to normal living. Daisy hasn't been doing well. She's really shy and hasn't connected with." Martin scowled. "What are you saying?" Sarah nervously went on. "Reuniting dogs from these circumstances with people who have experienced the same thing as them can sometimes improve their response. Although it's not always feasible. If you're amenable, we could attempt to introduce Daisy to Bailey here. It might be beneficial to her." Martin gazed out of the field where Bailey and Scout played his heart, and it might also provide Bailey with some closure. Considering the possibility of introducing another traumatic canine into his house, he wasn't sure how Scout would either respond or whether Bailey could manage the feelings of such a reunion. But the notion of offering Daisy an opportunity to recover hit a chord in him, so he answered firmly, "Let me try it. When can I bring him by?" A week later, Martin and Bailey returned to Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary, where they met in a peaceful outdoor setting. Penned with enough room for both dogs to feel at ease, Bailey's manner was remarkably serene while they awaited his. Gaz was staring at the door when Sarah pulled Daisy out, and the little, wiry dog shuddered. Her coat was obviously spotty, and she avoided making eye contact while her ears drooped low. With the people, But Bailey's tail started to wag hesitantly, and then more when he noticed her. Daisy froze with confidence, her big eyes fixed on Bailey for a prolonged period of time. Bailey took a hesitant step forward, his body language showing that neither dog had moved. When Bailey arrived, he squatted down while Daisy, who was kind and hospitable, sniffed the air with her tail tucked between her knees. To everyone's astonishment, Daisy took a moment to reassure them by lowering himself slightly to her level. Reluctantly moved closer, putting her nose to Bailey's. For what seemed like an eternity, the two stood nose to nose. Martin felt a knot in his throat as he saw the two souls who had persevered through a silent conversation that spoke volumes. Over the course of the following hour, the two canines found solace in each other's company. Grew inseparable, Daisy imitated Bailey's actions and gained confidence by watching him. By the end of their session, Sarah was grinning about the pen's safety. "Amazing," she added. "I've never seen Daisy get attached to a dog or a person so fast. It's like Bailey's giving her consent to trust once more." Martin nodded, his feelings threatening to overflow. "It appears that Bailey has a new job," he said, smiling slightly. "If you're willing, we'd love to see how Daisy does at your location. What's the next step?" "No pressure," Sarah replied, "but it might be exactly what she needs to get back to the farm." After an initial period of curiosity, Scout's transition was slow but endearing. Bailey, who was now a mentor in his own right, surprisingly easily accepted Daisy into their pack and helped her navigate He guided her through the customs of farm life, showing her the ideal places to take naps beneath the oak trees, and even encouraging her to play a milestone game. Something made Martin cry the first time he saw it. Daisy's presence also changed Martin. Taking care of two canines with such severe emotional scars presented him with unexpected challenges, but it also taught. One evening, as the dogs were huddled up by the fire, Martin taught him the value of patience and unconditional love. He patted Daisy's flank tenderly after reaching down to scratch Bailey behind the ears as he considered how far they had come. "You two are giving this old man some life lessons," he stated quietly. With Daisy's birth, a tension-filled undercurrent started to ripple as farm life settled into a new rhythm. Through the tranquility, Scout appeared more distant while Daisy and Bailey drew closer every day. The usually gregarious dog that had embraced Daisy so easily now spent more time looking at his head from a distance. Martin saw the change almost instantly, cocked as though considering something only he understood. He initially believed that Scout might be envious of Daisy's attention, but the dog's actions indicated something more profound because Scout was observing the pack and wasn't misbehaving or avoiding them as if he detected something. When Martin went outside with his coffee on a particularly chilly morning, the grass was coated in frost and he was unable to see. With his boots crunching, he discovered Scout seated at the field's edge, staring at the forest that surrounded it. Bailey and Daisy were playing close by on the farm, and their happy barks filled the chilly air. But Scout didn't. Scout didn't answer his question when his friend Martin, who was kneeling next to him, asked them where they were going. Unwaveringly focused, the property had always been surrounded by the woods, which Martin would sometimes walk to get some fresh air or get firewood. But now that Scout was looking at the thick woods, they appeared. As Martin sat by the fire with the dogs that evening, something odd seemed ominous. Curled up at his feet, he made the decision to look into the idea. It seemed absurd because he had seen everything in the woods previously, but if nothing else, Scout's uneasiness was contagious. After breakfast the next morning, Martin got his jacket, flashlight, and some peace of mind. He said, "Scout, you're coming with me," and the dog instantly jumped up and trotted beside Bailey. Daisy observed from the porch, their heads cocked in interest, the woods motionless, and as quiet but for the sound of Martin's boots crunching against the ground was amplified in the silence, as was the odd rustle of leaves in the breeze. Scout listened intently, turning around at every sound as they ventured farther into. Martin sensed that the well-traveled routes in the woods gave way to rough ground he hadn't traveled this far in years, and as he was ready to turn around, Scout suddenly stopped, his body tight, and he let out a loud growl. Shone his flashlight and muttered in his throat, "Easy boy, Martin." Ahead, the beam showed a disturbed area of the earth with dirt strewn about, as if something had been. Martin knelt down to examine it while digging there. There were a few faint traces all over the place. He saw a few pieces of cloth stuck to the underbrush close to his heart, but they were too blurry to make out. He stated in a steady but authoritative voice, "Quicken, Scout. Let's head back." Scout didn't. Martin followed the dog's line of sight, while keeping his eyes fixed on something in the distance. With his illumination, he could see a dark shape scuttling between the woods, though it was too quick to make out. Clearly there, his stomach roiled with a mixture of fascination and horror. "All right, let's go," Martin said, gently pulling at Scout's collar. Reluctantly, the dog complied, and they turned around. Back at home, Martin couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was missing, so he played Though it wasn't uncommon for wildlife to be drawn to the woods, he thought about the trace, the fabric, and the figure. He chose to call Sarah because something or someone had been there, and this seemed different. His voice was laden with explanation as he continued. "Do you think it could have something to do with Bailey or Daisy?" Sarah was silent for a while out of concern. Perhaps she confessed since the dogs we saved were a part of a bigger operation, we were unable to save every one of them, and we are unsure of what became of the others. For the others, it is not uncommon for those engaged in criminal activity to come in search of lost animals. Martin looked at Bailey and Daisy, who were already sleeping soundly by the fire, and the notion sent a chill down his spine. He questioned, "What should I do?" "Keep an eye out," Sarah advised, "if I'm not aware of the potential danger lurking just beyond the farm. Call the police right away if you spot anything suspect. And Martin, avoid taking any chances over the next few days." Martin closely monitored the woods, and Scout appeared more alert than ever, frequently positioning himself close to the perimeter of the property as though on guard. Bailey and Daisy were blissfully oblivious to their developing relationship, stronger every day. One evening, while Martin was closing the barn, he heard a slight rustling sound coming from He froze and tightened his palm around the latch in the direction of the woods. "Scout." A deep, ominous growl came at his side, causing Martin to strain his ears and feel his heart racing. He moved purposefully in the direction of the home as the sound approached once more, this time from an animal or the wind. As they arrived at the porch, Martin urged Scout to follow him. For a brief time, he believed he spotted the discomfort that had been bubbling beneath the surface now bubbled over when a pair of eyes reflected in the darkness. Martin felt that he couldn't ignore the lingering uneasiness any longer, regardless of what or whoever was out there. Daisy had turned into a shadow in Martin's generally tranquil routine over his farm, and Bailey's playful bond became stronger, but Scout's cautious attitude put Martin on the defensive. Suddenly, it seemed as though Scout had a better understanding of the situation in the woods than Martin did. Weighed hard on Martin's mind, and he was determined to solve the riddle, so he sought for assistance. Sarah goes into greater detail about the odd events, including the songs. Martin asked his voice, "Do you think someone could be after the dogs based on the fabric and the brief figure you saw?" On the other end of the line, Sarah sighed in worry. "It's possible, Martin. We've had incidents where Daisy might have been a part of something, where people engaged in illicit breeding or fighting rings attempted to retrieve their animals. The idea that she was being observed, even though you claimed she was discovered abandoned, chilled me." Martin spined as he looked out the window at the happy dogs playing in the yard, completely oblivious to the possibility. Martin began by saying, "What should I do, Sarah? I don't want anything to happen to them. Take pictures of the cloth and the tracks, record everything, and alert the police if you notice someone close to your property." Sarah stated unequivocally that during the next few days, "I'll also check with my contacts to see if anyone else has reported any strange activity." After a few days, Martin started to notice further little indications of entry. There was a disrupted spot in his normally immaculate farmyard, of dirt close to the forest border, and one of his storage barns had been left ajar, just a little, but nothing appeared to. Despite the anxiety Daisy was feeling, Scout's attention became even more acute, and he refused to leave Martin's side for very long. And Bailey offered a much-needed diversion. Their antics brought Martin endless happiness, and he discovered himself. Daisy had a talent for slipping into the kitchen while Martin wasn't looking, and he was grinning more frequently than he had in years. Bailey, who has always been a kind person, always comes out with something in her mouth, whether it's a roll, a sock, or even a spatula. would joyfully bark his protest as he chased her one evening while Martin looked on. He couldn't help but marvel at how much they had transformed his life as he watched the two dogs fight in the living room. Daisy's. A renewed sense of purpose had been sparked by boundless energy, and Martin was reminded of the, "You two definitely know how to keep me on my toes," Martin added, laughing as Daisy emphasized the value of connection and trust. Bailey Scout, who was resting close to the entryway, joyfully claimed a piece of rope from him. He thumped his tail once but maintained eye contact, fastened on the glass. As the days went by, Martin became more watchful and erected temporary obstacles along the properties, edged by blocking easy access from the woods with logs and old fencing. He also began to carry a lamp in his. Every time he stepped outside after dark, he carried a walking stick just in case. One afternoon, taking the initiative, Martin drove into town to visit the local sheriff's office, bringing with him. Sheriff Daniels listened to the pictures he had taken of the rails and the fabric. Daniels was a burly man with a decisive manner. Daniel analyzed the pictures carefully as Martin narrated the events, saying, "This doesn't look like random wildlife activity. These kind of tracks don't come from any animals in the area, and the fabric might have come from someone's clothes. Don't you think?" Martin's stomach twisted when he questioned whether he thought someone might have been on my property. Daniels acknowledged that there have been some reports of unusual activity in the vicinity, but nothing specific. "I'll dispatch a deputy to investigate, to keep watch over the area around your farm for the next few nights," in case. Martin nodded, feeling both relieved and uneasy. Although he valued the increased security, he was uneasy that evening because he thought someone might be targeting his house. Martin stood at the window looking out into the darkness as the dog got ready for bed, the moonlight casting an eerie glow. Scout slept at his feet while shadows moved across the fields and the woods beyond, appearing to be an impenetrable black wall of mystery. Bailey and Daisy were snuggled together on their shared bed, their soft snores causing his feet to twitch at every sound. Reassuring rhythm, Martin's mind drifted to Daisy's history, wondering who had deserted her and why. Such a precarious situation, and could that same individual or someone associated with them be the cause of the commotions? As he stood there thinking, Scout abruptly got up, his tail rigid, and a deep growl rumbled in his throat, making his ears perk up. "What is it, boy Martin?" Scout rushed to the door with his nose pressed against the crack, while whispering that his heart was quickening. A moment later, Martin noticed a faint sound coming from the direction of the woods, like twigs crackling beneath his feet. His walking stick and flashlight, his heart racing, he told the other dogs to stay here, even though he wasn't sure they knew was waiting for him. Prepare to follow. As Martin entered the music returned as the cool night air enveloped him like a blanket. This time, he aimed the flashlight closer to the woods, and for a brief moment, he saw the beam pierce the darkness. Nothing, and suddenly a shadow moved barely at the tree line, too big to be an animal and too fast to be a trick of the whatever or whoever was out was tightened by light. Martin's hold on the stick. Martin's heart raced as the shadow moved once more, this time vanishing, and they weren't welcome. He stood on the porch more into the woods, frozen for a moment, considering his next course of action. Scout stayed by his side. Low growls and a persistent need to remain vigilant, Martin muttered, clutching his walking stick firmly in place. He left the porch with his flashlight beam piercing the darkness and the chilly, thick air. He moved slowly in a spooky silence that made every crunch of his boots on the gravel sound deafening. The other dogs stayed behind their eyes, watching Martin's every move as Scout kept pace by his side at the edge of the woods. The path of broken twigs led Martin farther into the woodland than he had been in years via the living room window. In the dark, overgrown, and twisted trail, Scout's once familiar route appeared strange. He inhaled deeply, his body stiff and alert, ready to take in whatever that might be out there. Martin's voice was steady but loud enough to reverberate through the trees. There was only the sound of movement in response. Returning from his left, this time thoughtful and leisurely, Martin swung the beam in the direction of the sound, catching a fleeting view of a figure fleeing deeper into the forest. The individual was wearing a black jacket, and shadows covered his face. Fear made Martin's stomach turn, but his rage was even as intense. "Hey, you have no business here," Martin said, taking a. Scout gave a piercing yelp, and the person halted but did not turn back. The man then ran away and crashed through. Without hesitation, Martin handed Chase his stick-in-one-hand flashlight in the underbrush with reckless speed. His age misled him, but his years of hard work on the farm had kept him robust. As the chase continued, his legs hurt and his breathing became labored, but it ended suddenly when Martin wandered into a tiny clearing. The man was gone, but he noticed a shoddily built camp instead. A fire pit's remains were concealed among the woods, along with empty cans and a ripped sleeping bag. More chillingly, a massive rusted cage and a few pieces of rope, sufficient to accommodate a dog sitting in the shadows. Scout inspected the encampment and snarled at the cage. Martin's stomach churned as he put the pieces together. He discovered that the trespasser wasn't simply mindlessly wandering. Instead, they had been. He took a few pictures of the location using his phone as he was watching, waiting, and probably preparing something much worse. His hands shaking, he realized that the evidence needed to be reported, and he quickly turned to go. Scout gave a piercing yelp while standing rigidly close to the clearing's edge. Martin followed his eyes and noticed. He took up a collar that was partially hidden beneath leaves, and his heart fell. It was too little for Daisy or Bailey and appeared to be tattered and frayed. Was it from a previous dog that hadn't been so? With Scout leading the way at every turn, fortunate Martin rushed back to the property. The weight of what he had witnessed crushing down on him, the security of Daisy Bailey, and the woods felt heavier than before. When Scout arrived at the house, he hurried the door and contacted Sheriff Daniels since he felt unsafe now. Responded promptly, his tone composed but solemn when Martin shared what he had discovered, and he sent someone out right away. Martin, stay inside, lock your doors, and keep the dogs close, Daniel advised. Sounds like something we can't ignore. Martin hung up his chest tightly, displaying a mixture of fear and resolve. Turned to see all three dogs closely observing him. Daisy cocked her head and wagged her tail gently in apparent consolation. The protector sat beside the entrance, his eyes piercing, and Bailey placed his nose on Martin's knee and Scout ever. And uncompromising as we overcome this, Martin stated out loud, even though the words were. Within an hour, sheriff's deputies arrived, searching through the area, more for himself than for the dogs collectively. Martin led them to the woods with lanterns and safety equipment, showed them the pictures he had shot, and Sheriff Daniels surveyed the surroundings, looking at the cage and the improvised camp with a grim face. Daniels stated, "Whoever this is, they have a plan, and it's not just trespassing." "It's not a good one," Martin said, swallowing hard and strengthening his resolve. "What should we do now?" "We'll keep an eye on your property. In-depth research will also be done on this website to determine whether it is related to any documented instances of animal abuse or trafficking." Daniel's reply in the interim, "You must exercise caution and never let the dogs alone. Not even for." Martin was unable to sleep that night, so he sat in the living room. The Scout lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every creak, and a shotgun he hadn't touched in years rested across his lap. Daisy and Bailey were nestled together on the couch in the house, their breathing calm and slow. It was intolerable to him to lose any of them. These dogs had evolved beyond being merely animals to him. Family. And, as the hours passed, anyone who wanted to hurt them would have to go through him first. Martin's thoughts were racing. Who was the man in the woods? Was he by himself? Or was? Why had he targeted Martin's farm? And was there a bigger operation behind him? Answers seemed frustratingly elusive, but it was obvious that this was not the end. Over Martin's farm, the morning began with an unsettling silence. The typical symphony of birdsong seemed muffled, as though Martin Rose, who had spent a sleepless night on the couch, was holding his breath as the woods themselves did. Scout, with the shotgun still at his side, stretched and yawned, wagging his tail momentarily before his piercing eyes turned. Even the dog's carefree excitement felt strained by the tension in the air as Martin fed them toward the window, as usual. Calmed, he made sure the windows and doors were locked before going outside to evaluate the farms. Daisy and Bailey remained behind to guard the fence and make sure there were no indications of additional trespassing. But Scout never. Sentinel trailed behind him, and Martin's thoughts were troubled by the revelations from the night before. The cage, the man in the woods, and the campground painted a bleak image, and he couldn't get rid of the thought that whoever had been snooping on his property wasn't finished yet. As Martin strolled around the edge of his property, he noticed more footprints close by. His heart plummeted when he saw the intentional tracks that led straight to his barn on the eastern fence line. He accelerated. His ears were alert and perked up as his pay scout trotted beside him when he arrived at the barn, he stopped and tightened his hold on the shotgun. The big wooden doors were a sharp contrast. He motioned for Scout to remain back, but the dog disregarded him because of how well he always closed and secured them. Martin pushed the door wide as he approached, a low growl vibrating in his chest, and was met with a scene that made him furious because he saw that feed sacks had been ripped open and multiple tools had been knocked over, scattered over the floor, but the improvised trap and tripwire near the door were what most attracted his attention. Martin murmured, "Whoever you are, lead me to a heavy net hidden in the hay. You're not getting away with this." Martin muttered as he gently disassembled the trap, his hands steady in spite of the Scout smelled the area where his nose led him, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Another piece of evidence was a duffel bag in a dark area of the barn, partially hidden by hop pails. Martin's blood burned as he was packed with ropes, gloves, and what looked like tranquilizer darts. This wasn't just someone who had come ready to remove his pets, or worse, a random trespasser, took the duffel bag and took it outside of his resolve, solidifying Sheriff Daniels. Came soon after Martin summoned him, and the sheriff's face clouded as he looked at the bag and the mess in the. Daniel replied sadly, "Barn, this is getting worse. Whoever this is, we'll have to set our own trap because it's dangerous and well organized." Martin nodded his. "I'm not letting them take my dogs, Sheriff, and I'll stop at nothing to protect them." Daniels put "Let catch them, Martin, but you must let us handle this. I'm assigning deputies to watch over them. Stake out your property tonight so that as the sun sets, we'll be prepared if this guy shows up again." Deputies established monitoring after horizon. The property turned into a center of silent activity. Equipment throughout the land, their cars concealed in the wood shadows. Martin observed from his deck A. With a mixture of resolve and dread on his face, Scout sat next to him, head resting on Martin's knee as Daisy and Bailey remained nearby, observing their normally stoic owner's uneasiness. Every rustle of leaves and every creak in the house made the waiting agonizing. Martin's nerves tingled because he knew the intruder would return. It was only a question of when, at midnight. A slight rustle near the barn shattered the silence, and the deputies, concealed amid the woods, nodded to one another and, ready to go. Martin couldn't stay still, so he picked up his shotgun and went outside. Scout was by his side right away. Through the faint moonlight, Martin saw the same man again, his stance stiff and his ears perked up. He had previously been crouching close to the barn door, fumbling with something that was probably creating another trap for Martins. When he became angry, he signaled for the Scout to remain close to the deputies who were closing in by moving slowly and deliberately. As the man tried to slip, their footsteps became hushed, and one of them radioed to Sheriff Daniels, who was positioned nearby. With their torches blazing, the sheriff and his team came from the barn. Daniel yelled in a powerful, demanding voice, and the man froze for a moment. Martin didn't think twice before he and Scout chased the deputies who were closely behind them before running into the woods. The woods behind the chase were a flurry of activity, with branches breaking and cries, Scout moving more quickly, and, more nimble than the deputies, he swiftly closed the gap and pounced at the man, knocking him off balance, tripped and dropped the duffel bag he was carrying, causing more traps to fall out. The cops apprehended and detained the man who thrashed and yelled profanities using ropes and a map of Martin's land. Daniels walked up to Stern, who was looking at the things that had spilled. "You have a lot of explaining to do, As the deputies held the man away, Martin knelt and the sheriff spoke in a chilly tone. He whispered, "Nice job, boy," as he ran a hand through Scout's fur. Scout's eyes were full of pride, and his voice was full of emotion. Martin stood and observed as the relief rushed over him as the sheriff's squad secured the area and collected evidence. However, it was moderated by the knowledge that this experience had shown how precarious his life and the lives of his After the deputies left the man, the farmhouse was eerily quiet. Even though he was now in detention, Martin's uneasiness persisted. The duffel bag and its contents created a terrifying image. This was a planned event rather than an isolated occurrence. A methodical scout, always alert, remained by his side as though he could sense his. Martin had been reassured by Sheriff Daniels that the man would be questioned, but the sheriff's departure. Martin thought, we could have caught him, but guys like this. The idea that they frequently don't work alone made Martin shiver the next day. Martin spent hours installing cameras, strengthening fences, and setting up security measures on the day he decided to make the farm more safe. Scout Daisy, Bailey, and motion-activated lights relentlessly followed him after detecting. Despite taking extra precautions, Martin couldn't help but think about the significance of his work and what may have happened. If Scout hadn't been around, Martin would have concluded it was time for a sunset when the sun set. He took a rare break and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Bailey and Daisy snuggled up next to him, and Scout curled at his feet. For the first time in days, the night's stillness seemed reassuring close by. Instead, hours later, Martin's phone rang, shattering the serene Sheriff Daniel's voice on the other end of his sharp, urgent tone. Martin, we're having an issue with the man we captured last night isn't speaking, but we found enough proof to believe he was collaborating with others. More deputies are patrolling the area tonight, and Martin's hold on the phone seems to have tightened. Daniels acknowledged that they might return, but don't take any chances and keep the dogs close. The warning weighed heavy on Martin, so don't be afraid to phone us if you see something suspect. Before relaxing into the living room that evening, Scout made a 6-check of the locks on the windows and doors. Daisy and Bailey remained close as usual, lying close to the front entrance with their ears pricked up. The night went by without incident, and Martin started to question whether his paranoia was winning out. But right before dawn, a faint sound outside made his pulse thumping. He seized a shotgun and scuttled toward the rear of the house when he heard a rustle. Window through the moon's pale light, he noticed movement close to the barn. Another shadowy figure was. Martin's grip tightened on the shotgun as he attempted to pry open the barn door. Without waiting for the authority, he silently unlocked the rear door, indicating to the scouts to remain low and follow them as they approached. As they got closer to Martin, the damp earth muted their footfall. Got a closer look at the tall, wiry intruder, who was holding something and had a mask covering their face. A robust, yet compact cage, and the idea of his dogs being taken filled Martin with an intense sense of defense. He emerged from the shadows, pointing the shotgun toward the ground and yelling, "Step away from the barn." The figure hesitated, then dropped the cage and fled into the woods. But Martin was prepared. Scout complied with his order and ran after the intruder, cutting his slender physique. Martin kept a steady pace behind the man as he staggered through the shadows like a shadow, and Scout caught. By the time Martin got to them, they were snapping at his heels and making him slow down. The man was down on the ground with his hands up in submission. Martin snarled, holding the. As the intruder reached for his phone to call the sheriff, the deputies quickly arrived with a shotgun focused on him. Sheriff Daniels paced in apparent frustration as he took the second intruder into custody. He mumbled, "There's a larger problem," as he pieced together the circumstances. "These canines are not merely targets. They are prizes for the network at work." Martin's jaw tightened. "Not on my face. As someone who views people as a means to an end." Daniels agreed. "And for the time being, we'll continue doing what we're doing." Martin was standing in the barn scout at dawn, "and we'll increase patrols around your property." The farm had always been his haven, but the events of the last several days had altered something inside of him. Felt like a battlefield, one he would protect no matter what. Scout pushed Martin's hand, his gaze silent. "Recognizing that you've done well," Martin remarked softly, scratching behind Scout's ears. The next few days were calmer now that the intruders were in custody, and the tension surrounding the property started to decrease. Martin kept making enhancements to the security of his home, but he also made time to enjoy the small pleasures in life with his dogs. As he observed Scout Daisy and Bailey playing in the yard one evening, he came to the realization, the fact that they were more than simply animals to him. They were family, and nobody bothered Martin's. The shadows of the recent occurrences started to fade as family days stretched into weeks and the intruders were taken into custody. And Sheriff Daniels told Martin that a larger network of illicit dog trafficking was being uncovered by the inquiry. The scouts' bravery and Martin's collaboration had become essential to their attempts at the peaceful existence on the farm, but it felt different now because it wasn't only a haven, it was a fortress. And Martin awoke one morning to the sound of the scouts' harsh barking in. He hurried outdoors after grabbing his jacket and putting on his boots after being surprised by the yard. Scout was standing close to the gate, barking and waving his tail alertly at a truck that had pulled into the driveway. Martin Daniels greeted Sheriff Daniels in the morning as he got out of the car with a deputy behind him with a loving smile on his arms and a tiny puppy with floppy ears and a shy face. Martin's eyes brightened as he saw a carrier with 2 more puppies that we thought you'd want to see. Approached the sheriff and inquired, "What's this about?" in a curious tone. The puppy eagerly toddled toward Scout, who gingerly inspected it after Daniels crouched down and placed it on the ground. "These are a few of the canines we saved from the surgery you assisted us in cracking." Before you give a gentle sigh of approval, Martin stared at the open Daniels, who stated that they were searching for a house and that I couldn't think of a better one than yours. Scout looked back to the babies in the carrier and appeared to nod in approval as the puppy licked his nose. For a man who had disliked dogs for a large portion of his life, the occasion felt. Martin stumbled and ran a hand across his mouth, saying, "Surreal. I don't know. I already have a lot on my plate with Bailey Daniels and Scout E. Daisy." Laughed well. "Except from these little ones. Scout appears to believe you can handle it. Requires someone who can relate to their experiences." Martin squatted down to allow the small dog to come into his. His determination was overcome by its gentle fleece and dependable gaze. "I suppose one more. Couldn't hurt," he whispered, getting Scout to bark in agreement. The deputies grinned and put the other 2 puppies in. As the sheriff got ready to depart, he turned back to find a safe spot in the yard where they could stretch their legs. "Martin, you are aware that you have not only broken up a criminal organization, but also offered these animals a second chance. People would have taken the initiative like you did." Martin nodded, feeling proud because they deserved it. Stated simply that all of them were present that night, and the sounds of playful yips and barks filled the land. Puppies had boundless energy to explore their environment, while Scout Daisy and Bailey alternated in keeping watch over them. As one of the puppies attempted to chase a butterfly that was falling over its own paws Martin thought about how much the man who used to view dogs as nothing more had changed while he was sitting on the porch. Then a bother had not only grown to adore them, but also turned into their most ferocious guardian. Scout's presence had sparked a sequence of events that, as the sun sank below, changed his life and his purpose. The puppy clambered up the front stairs as Horizon Martin called the dogs over. As Scout and the others took their places at his feet, Martin climbed into his lap and gazed at the little lively pack, feeling a deep appreciation. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he muttered. The devoted dog gazed up at Scout, its tail gently wagging as it scratched behind his ears. Martin's farm, as if to convey that we're in this together for the next few weeks, became a shelter for the community, as well as the dogs, and others started coming because of the farmer's narrative. Neighbors gave assistance with repairs. The sheriff even came to play with the puppies, and his canine friends' kids. Visited the farm on a regular basis after a lonely retreat had turned a. One day, while Martin was caring for the garden, he came into a place of healing and connection. He saw Scout wagging his tail at a young woman with a camera by the fence. She identified herself. She asked Martin, a writer working on a piece on the rescued dogs and their impact, "What are you?" Martin stopped and glanced at Scout and the others, who showed me something that made you reconsider your opinion of dogs. He mentioned loyalty, affection, and an unknown bravery that I had been missing. Existence. The story went viral, and Martin's farm became a symbol. They didn't just alter my opinion. They transformed my life. Donations poured in to help the pups as a result of hope and redemption, and requests to adopt the puppies quickly followed. But Martin ensured that each puppy was placed in a family where they would get genuine love and care. Save for the first one, a small puppy that Martin named Chance that Sheriff Daniels had put in Martin's arms. Martin experienced a deep sense of homecoming as he sat on the porch with Scout at his side and Chance dozing off in his lap. feeling of tranquility despite the unexpected and challenging nature of the voyage. Each step in his second life had been worthwhile. As the stars started to shine above Scout, Martin whispered and lifted his glass of iced tea. Scout let out a faint whimper. The property was silent again as chance and agreement stretched closer. But as the weeks passed, it was a different type of quiet one, full of love, loyalty, and the promise of fresh starts. The farm developed into more than just a house. It became a center of activity and a haven for fresh life. In addition to touching hearts in the neighborhood, Martin and his dog's story inspired individuals all over the. Strangers wrote messages to the country expressing thanks, admiration, and Martin was humbled by the influence Scout Chons and the others had on him after hearing their own second chances experiences. Made well beyond the limits of his land, Martin went outdoors one brisk fall morning with a hot cup of coffee as the fields were flooded in golden light from the rising sun. Scouts were always on guard. A ball of adolescent energy rushed ahead of him, tail wagging Chance. Martin grinned to himself as he barked at the rustling leaves as though they were alive. As he observed the puppy pursuing an imaginary adversary, Scout softly barking. "I have the spirit, little guy," he said. Agreement, sitting next to his human as though to convey that he is now one of us. R.M. Martin found a new rhythm and carried on working the land. But now he had Scout following him. Curious about everything Bailey and Daisy ever do, they are everywhere like a shadow and chanting beneath your feet. Kept a close watch on the younger dog, extending their patience beyond the secluded life that Martin had adopted. Felt far away now that he had a purpose in life and spent his evenings surrounded by the peaceful, happy pandemonium of. He had discovered something he hadn't even realized he was looking for: connection and companionship with his four-legged family, and the straightforward delight of living in the community, which had welcomed the farm's metamorphosis from what had begun as a. Martin works at a small sanctuary that was transformed from a location to place rescued pets, collaborating with local volunteers and Sheriff Daniels to establish a location where animals in need could recuperate and find new families in order to see the dogs. Families and school groups began visiting the once quiet farm on weekends to hear their tales. Martin had even begun instructing kids on how to take care of animals, demonstrating to them the value of empathy and accountability, observing their wide-eyed wonder as they played with Chance or petted Scout. Gave him a sense of calm pride. One night, when the first stars appeared in the sky, Martin sat on the porch with a journal in hand. He had begun recording his thoughts, a practice that a generous neighbor had encouraged because he thought it may. The pages were full of reflections on the previous months and the day to help him comprehend what he had gone through. As he penned Scout, the terrifying occurrences involving the intruders and the happy arrival of the puppies brought Scout into his life. Put his head on Martin's knee, and, as he slept by his feet, Martin paused, his little snores shattering the quiet. "You two changed everything," he murmured quietly, glancing down at his devoted friends. As Scout's tail pounded on the porch, Chance yawned and then curled up the farm's harvest once more. The next significant milestone for neighbors and guests was the festival, which is now an annual event, gathering to commemorate the farm's journey and its dogs, which Martin never won for the public, as well as the season. As Sheriff Daniels handed him a microphone and cleared his throat, Martin, who was speaking, found himself in the spotlight. "I've never been good with words," he said, looking out the throng. His voice was calm, but emotional but throughout the past year, these dogs have taught me a lot about love, loyalty, and second chances. Reminded me that there's always space for something new to emerge, even when life seems barren. As the crowd erupted in cheers, Martin took a step back and gave a sheriff the microphone with a. Scout nodded appreciatively, barked as though echoing the sentiment, and then Chance wagged his tail. Martin moved through the throng with enthusiasm as the event came to an end, pausing to chat with old friends, and children from new acquaintances rushed up to pet Scout, who graciously and patiently absorbed their attention as Chance flew away. Margaret Tom, the diner, absorbing up every ounce of love from one person to the next. "You've done something amazing here," the owner stated as she walked up to Martin holding a plate of her renowned apple pie. Warm with adoration, Martin shook his head and grinned. It's not just me. The town is better because of it. It's all of us on this farm, he said, adding that these dogs have united us. Martin stood on the porch, overlooking the now quiet farm with the lamps as the final visitors left. Placed around the barn created a gentle glow, and Scout sat next to it as the cool night air carried the subtle aroma of apples and hay. Chance lay splayed on the porch stairs, his little body rising and falling with him as his eyes were focused on the horizon. Martin replied out loud, his voice laced with amusement, I sure can't. Each breath was fair for a man who didn't like dogs. As Martin bent down to scratch behind his ears and Scout leaned against him, he thought about what life would be like without them. Softly, he addressed you, boy, and all the second chances we never anticipate. For those who heard it, Martin and his dog's story served as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the most unexpected, even though the farm continued to thrive, it remained fundamentally a testimony to the idea that moments may bring about significant change. Irreversible tie between a guy and his pets. If this amazing adventure inspires you, please share your comments. Remember to hit the notification bell, like this video, and subscribe to our channel in the comment section below to never. Thank you for viewing, and we hope to see you in the future video. Miss more touching tales like this one?